Before her sat her father, King Ptolemaic, the founder of a dynasty obsessed with bloodlines and power. He did not speak to her as a father, but as a ruler calculating the worth of cattle. "Arsinoe," he said, "you will marry your brother." The word struck like a blade. The chamber seemed to shrink. The girl's heart pounded in her chest. But in this dynasty, there was no room for shock. Incest was not a crime here. It was a tradition. To the Ptolemies, purity of blood meant more than innocence, more than morality, more than the will of their own children. She was trapped in a dynasty where love was twisted into politics, where fathers became tyrants and brothers became husbands. It was a grotesque legacy, one that cloaked cruelty in the language of divine destiny. The rulers of Egypt claimed to be gods, and gods were above human law. Arsinoe stood frozen, silent, her voice stolen by fear. She did not fight, for there was no escape. She did not weep, for tears were weakness in a palace where weakness was punished. She simply bowed her head. For Arsinoe, childhood ended that night. Egypt, once ruled by the pharaohs, had been shattered by the conquest of Alexander the Great. When Alexander died in 323 BC, his empire stretched from Greece to India, but it was too vast, too fragile to survive without him. His generals carved it apart like vultures fighting over a corpse. And one of them, a Macedonian named Ptolemy, seized Egypt. Ptolemy was not Egyptian by blood. He was Greek, a soldier, not a god. But to rule this ancient land, he needed more than soldiers. He needed myth. And so the Ptolemaic dynasty was born. They crowned themselves pharaohs, declared themselves living gods, and wrapped themselves in the sacred rituals of Egypt. But beneath the hieroglyphs and golden crowns, the Ptolemies remained Greek at heart, cunning, ruthless, and obsessed with power. But behind those jeweled doors, the air was poisoned. Every feast was shadowed by betrayal. Every marriage was a political gamble. And at the heart of this world was a grotesque belief that siblings should marry siblings. Ordinary people. Incest was unthinkable. To the Ptolemies, it was divine. By marrying brothers to sisters, they claimed to mirror the gods themselves, Zeus and Hera, Isis and Osiris. They preached purity, but in truth, it was about control. By keeping the royal bloodline untouched, they locked power inside their family and kept rivals away. But for the children of the dynasty, this divine tradition was a prison. Arsinoe was born into this gilded cage. From her first breath, her life was mapped out. She would never be free to choose her husband, her body, or her destiny. She would marry for the dynasty, for power, for survival. The palace trained her to smile in public, to bow to her father, to sit in silence when decisions were made about her future. Even as a girl, she would have heard whispers of marriages where brothers became husbands, of queens forced into the arms of their kin. She would have seen the statues of gods who were also siblings, their stories twisted into justification for human cruelty. Arsinoe's childhood was not filled with games or freedom, but with shadows. Every lesson, every ritual, reminded her of the path she could not escape. She was a princess raised among gold and marble, yet her heart was still that of a child, eager, curious, innocent. She adored the myths of both worlds that shaped her, the Greek stories of heroes and gods her tutors whispered, and the Egyptian tales of Ra's sun journey that the priests recited. She was a child of two cultures, caught between Olympus and the Nile. And like any little girl, she dreamed not of power, but of beauty, music, and stories. But in the palace of the Ptolemies, innocence was never allowed to last. For behind the laughter of musicians and the perfume of flowers loomed a darker shadow. Her father, Ptolemaic. To the outside world, he was a great general who had marched beside Alexander the Great and carved an empire from the bones of Egypt. But to his children, he was not merely a father. He was a ruler, cold and calculating. Ptolemy did not see Arsinoe as a little girl who loved temples and scrolls. He saw her as a weapon. In the Ptolemaic court, daughters were not cherished. They were currency, pieces in a game that spanned kingdoms. And for Ptolemy, one truth overrode all else. The dynasty must survive. To keep the throne safe, marriages could not be left to chance. Outsiders could not be trusted with royal blood. The solution was as ruthless as it was horrifying. Children would be married to their siblings, or worse, to their own fathers. This was not whispered as shame. It was dressed in the robes of religion. Court scholars declared that the gods themselves had lived this way. Osiris had married Isis, brother to sister. Zeus had lain with his daughters. What mortals called incest, kings called divine. Arsinoe, still a child, began to notice the words that floated through corridors late at night. Servant whispering of divine unions. Advisers praising her beauty as if it were not her own, but an offering to her father's ambition. She must have felt it creeping closer, the moment her childhood would be stripped away. She began to understand that the very blood in her veins, celebrated as royal and divine, was the same blood that chained her. Her toys were taken from her, her scrolls and games replaced with veils and ornaments. She was dressed as a bride before she was old enough to understand what marriage truly meant. Arsinoe's innocence was stolen not in a single moment, but in the slow suffocation of expectation. Every day she was reminded that her body, her choices, her very life did not belong to her. It belonged to the dynasty, to her father. And so the child who once dreamed of myths and music was pushed toward a nightmare no child should ever endure, a union not of love, but of blood, a marriage not chosen, but forced. Behind her lowered eyes, Arsinoe felt only the silence of grief. Each step on the marble floor echoed like the toll of a funeral bell. The fragrance of incense, meant to honor her, clung to her throat like smoke. And as the voices roared her name, praising her as a goddess reborn, she knew what they were really celebrating was her captivity. It was divine. For Arsinoe, it was a prison. She was not walking to a throne. She was walking to a cage. The marriage was a careful design of her father, Ptolemaic. Whispers spread through the palace halls, woven into every hymn sung by priests and every decree etched into stone. The gods themselves were siblings, Isis and Osiris, Zeus and Hera. What is sacred in heaven must also be sacred on earth. It was said with reverence, with conviction, as though repeating it enough time could turn violation into holiness. But beneath the crown of gold, Arsinoe knew what the chants truly meant. Her body was not her own. Her bloodline had been stolen, reproposed, shackled to politics she could never escape. Her brother, the boy who once shared games with her in the gardens, who had laughed with her over lies and stories, was now recast as her husband. The bond of childhood had been twisted into something grotesque. The same hand that once tossed figs to her across the courtyard would now be commanded to touch her as a man touches a wife. In the public squares, her union was painted as sacred. Statues rose of her and her brother standing side by side, their profiles chiseled into marble as though they were gods reborn. The city feasted. Wine spilled. Musicians played. Priests swore that Egypt itself had been blessed. But behind closed doors, Arsinoe felt only dread. She was no goddess, no Isis, no Hera. She was a daughter robbed of her will, a sister forced into a parody of marriage, a woman who could no longer claim even the sanctity of her own skin. And when the door closed on her wedding night, the incense faded, and the trumpets silenced, she knew that what the world called divine was nothing more than the silence of her own horror. Court priests lifted their voices to the heavens, calling the union a gift of the gods. Behold Isis and Osiris reborn. Behold Hera and Zeus among us. What is holy above must be holy below. Scholars, desperate for favor, bent their words into flattery. They inked verses that likened Arsinoe to Aphrodite herself, a goddess of beauty, purity, and divine love. In their poems, she was not a prisoner but a celestial bride, a creature of eternity, draped in divinity. And so, on papyrus and in marble, her suffering was painted as holiness. But the marble walls could not silence whispers. Servants muttered in the shadows of kitchens and stables. They lowered their voices, eyes darting, as they asked one another if such things could truly be sacred. They remembered the old ways, the purity of family, the bonds that were never meant to be broken. Among the common Egyptians, the murmurs were sharper, braver. At the markets, over baskets of grain and amphorae of wine, they spoke of corruption, of kings and queens who wrapped themselves in the names of gods to mask their shame. They call it holy, some said, but holiness does not come with chains. The hypocrisy was naked, but no one dared name it too loudly. To speak against the Ptolemies was to court death. So the whispers lived only in corners, carried like smoke between the cracks of stone, unrecorded by scribes, unacknowledged in the triumph of court. For Arsinoe, those whispers were a cruel echo. The world praised what she despised, glorified what she mourned. She heard her name spoken in temples with reverence, and in servants' quarters with pity. She was Aphrodite in scrolls, Isis in statues, but in truth, she was only a woman stripped of her freedom, her pain varnished into pageantry. Power had dressed itself as religion. Corruption had clothed itself in holiness. And Arsinoe had been made the sacrifice. She did not move. She did not weep. She simply stared, her body rigid, her breath shallow, as though any motion might break her already fractured spirit. And then the door opened. Her brother, now her husband, entered. His face was pale, his steps hesitant. He, too, was a prisoner of their father's ambition, caught in a web that left no room for refusal. Once, he had been her companion, her playmate in childhood games within the palace gardens. Now, by decree of a crown and by the lies of priests, he was her consort. Neither spoke. There were no words for this, only silence. Outside, the city believed this night were holy. Priests had blessed their bed. Scribes would record it as a union of gods. But within the chamber, the truth was suffocating. It was not love. It was not divinity. It was power, cold, merciless power, forcing two souls into a ritual they both despised. That night was not a celebration. It was a funeral for her freedom. There had been a time when Arsinoe's life felt her own. As a child, she had asked questions that startled her tutors. Why the Nile rose and fell, why the stars moved in patterns across the sky, why men prayed to gods who never answered. She had loved books, scrolls, maps, things that gave her the sense of a world beyond palace walls. She once believed she might walk into that world, carrying her curiosity like a lantern. But that girl was vanishing. Each day of her betrothal, she felt herself hollowing, skin stretched thin over silence. Courtiers no longer praised her mind, nor her wit, nor even her grace in conversation. Instead, their eyes lingered on her shoulders, her lips, the curve of her face. Every compliment was a blade disguised as a flower. The gods themselves could not craft fairer skin. Such beauty will secure the throne. She began to understand that beauty was not a gift. It was a chain. The palace whispered of her as though she were not a person but an offering. A jewel for Egypt's crown, they said. A vessel to preserve the blood of the gods. She was no longer Arsinoe, the girl who once pressed ink papyrus with trembling fingers, desperate to record her thoughts before they slipped away. She was only a symbol now, her body, her blood, her womb claimed by ambition greater than her will. She felt herself fading each time the priest called her divine bride. That name was not hers. It belonged to a fiction, a shadow self who would never be allowed to laugh, to question, to choose. The real Arsinoe, the child who once knelt by the river to watch fish dart through reeds, was being buried alive beneath gold and incense. And in her quiet despair, she recognized the truth. She was not a bride. She was a living sacrifice. A sacrifice the dynasty demanded, smiling as it stripped away her identity and placed a crown upon her silence. Arsinoe's first nights as a bride were marked by silence. Silence heavier than the golden walls, heavier than the watchful gods painted above her bed. She had been broken, bent into a shape carved not by her own hands, but by her father's ruthless ambition. Every dream she once carried, of learning, of choosing, of living freely, was smothered beneath the suffocating weight of dynasty. To the courtiers, she was nothing more than a vessel. To the priests, a living altar. To her father, a pawn moved across the board of kingdoms. Yet within that silence, something else stirred. Humiliation had stripped her of innocence, but humiliation is a dangerous teacher. Each ritual that sought to erase her, each whisper that reduced her to flesh, did not kill her spirit. It tempered it. Beneath the ashes of obedience, a new Arsinoe began to take form. One who would learn the rules not to obey them, but to twist them. One who would turn beauty, charm, and silence into weapons sharper than bronze. Arsinoe entered this world as a victim, a girl pressed into a marriage she never chose. But soon, she began to understand that to survive in Alexandria's court was not to weep in silence. It was to listen, to watch, to adapt. At first, she learned to smile when her heart was breaking. When courtiers praised her beauty, she bowed her head as if humbled, though inside she felt the sting of humiliation, knowing they spoke of her flesh, not her mind. When priests compared her to Aphrodite, she played the role, even as her stomach churned at the mockery. Arsinoe began to see that power did not always belong to the strongest or the boldest. In a court where words were daggers, survival depended on wearing masks. Her silence became a shield. Her charm, a trap. Where once she had been prey, now she became the hunter disguised as lamb. In the Ptolemaic palace, betrayal was not the exception. It was a currency. Brothers plotted against sisters, mothers whispered poison into the ears of sons, generals bribed eunuchs, and servants sold secrets for bread. Arsinoe watched as alliances rose and fell overnight. A cousin once favored by the king was banished in disgrace after whispers of disloyalty. A rival wife, once radiant with jewels, disappeared without warning, her name erased from official records, her face scratched out from frescoes. Fear was the air they breathed, and so Arsinoe learned. She studied the patterns of betrayal like a mathematician studies numbers. She memorized which smiles hid knives. She tested her words like arrows before releasing them. Every deception made her sharper. Every cruelty made her harder. Her suffering had once silenced her. Now, she found ways to turn it into power. She began to weaponize her beauty, not as a gift, but as a snare. She learned how a glance could make a rival falter, how a kind word could earn a servant's loyalty, how a feigned tear could soften an enemy's suspicion. Her pain became a performance. When the priest glorified her marriage to her brother as holy union, she played the role of the divine bride. But behind her bowed head, her mind was awake, calculating. Every humiliation became a mask she could wear and discard. Every scar became a reminder that she was still alive, and that living was the most dangerous weapon in a court where survival was itself a victory. The palace was not only a place of splendor, but also a hive of whispers. Servants carried gossip like bees carried nectar. Eunuchs controlled access to chambers, holding more power than generals. Courtiers schemed with foreign envoys, selling influence for gold. Arsinoe placed herself at the center of this web. Slowly, she gathered allies, not out of trust, but out of necessity. A disfavored scribe who knew how to forge letters. A maid overlooked by others, who heard secrets while pouring wine. A foreign tutor, willing to share forbidden knowledge in exchange for protection. She learned to trade in whispers. She learned which rumors to spread, which to silence, and which to plant like seeds in the cracks of her enemies' foundations. The same palace that had once smothered her now became her training ground. Arsinoe was scarred by her upbringing, scarred by incestuous politics, by being forced into the role of bride and pawn, by watching her family devour itself in the name of survival. But those scars did not break her. They sharpened her. She began to embody the very cruelty that once destroyed her, not out of choice, but out of necessity. For in the Ptolemaic dynasty, kindness was suicide. To survive was to become serpent among serpents. What does suffering do to a soul when endured long enough? It carves away weakness. It strips illusions. It teaches a cruel lesson, that innocence is a luxury for the powerless. Arsinoe understood this with a clarity that few in her court could match. She had been innocence itself once, a girl who loved learning, who asked questions, who dreamed of freedom. That girl was gone. In her place stood something new, something forged in silence, sharpened by humiliation, hardened by betrayal. A creature born of poison, yet unpoisoned. By the time whispers of Arsinoe spread beyond the palace walls, she was no longer seen as merely a bride or a pawn. She had become a figure to be watched carefully, spoken of cautiously. Her enemies did not know when she had changed, only that she had. The girl who once sat weeping before golden prison bars was gone. In her place stood Arsinoe II, still young, still bound, but already a strategist in the making. Priests raised incense to the heavens, declaring, "Behold Arsinoe, sister and wife of the king, living goddess on oath." To the people, she was no longer mortal. She was a vessel of divinity, an earthly reflection of Isis herself. Statues of her adorned temples, her name carved alongside gods. Poets sang of her radiance, her purity, her sacred bond with her royal brothers. But beneath the golden crown, Arsinoe carried wounds no hymn could sanctify. Her path to power was paved with blood and calculation. She had already endured what most women would call unbearable, forced into a union not of love, but of dynasty. Yet Arsinoe refused to drown in victimhood. Step by step, she mastered the language of the court, silence when silence meant survival, smiles when smiles concealed daggers. Her first husband brother, Ptolemy II, stood at her side as co-ruler. Together, They presented the image of divine harmony, two siblings united as God had once been. But their bond was not born of affection. It was a performance stage for the masses. Behind the curtain, Arsinoe began maneuvering, learning how to bend courtiers, priests, and generals to her will. The very incest that had been her prison became her armor. If she was forced to be the sacred sister-wife, then she would wield that sanctity like a sword. From the outside, her life glittered. Gold palanquins carried her through the streets. Her face appeared on coins, immortalized in silver and bronze. Every gesture, every word, was cloaked in divine imagery. She was worshipped, adored, untouchable. But worship is its own kind of cage. Arsinoe II lived in two worlds. In one, she was a goddess adored. In the other, a woman erased. Which was a mask, and which the truth? Perhaps, over time, even she no longer knew. Despite her divine image, Arsinoe never escaped the echo of her father's command. Every ritual with her brother husband was a reminder of her lack of choice. Every prayer offered to her as goddess wife felt like mockery. And yet, she did not break. Instead, she transformed. The humiliation that once crushed her now became fuel. If she had to play the goddess, then she would become more divine than any of them dared imagine. If they expected her to be a pawn, she would turn herself into a queen who could not be ignored. In public, Arsinoe was serene, radiant, untouchable. The people saw in her the beauty of Egypt itself, eternal and sacred. She was a smiling statue, the perfect bride of the gods. But in the shadows of the palace, whispers grew. Courtiers spoke of her cunning, her unshakable will. Rivals who underestimated her found themselves exiled, silenced, or mysteriously ruined. Arsinoe learned the art of poison, not always literal, but political. Her words dripped like venom, carefully placed, subtly fatal. Where once she had been powerless, she now bent power to her will. But one question lingered in her soul. Did she embrace the role, or bury herself beneath it? Some historians argue she grew to believe her own divinity, that she accepted the mask so completely it became her truth, that she no longer saw herself as a victim, but as chosen by the gods. Others suggest the opposite, that every coronation, every hymn sung to her, was a cool reminder of the chains her father had forged, that beneath the crown she carried an unhealed wound, a wound she hid behind her smile. What does survival demand? To believe the lie until it becomes your truth, or to carry the truth in silence until it poisons you from within? One story tells that Arsinoe often stood before a great mirror of polished bronze, gazing not at her beauty, but at the crown upon her head. Did she see herself as a goddess, or as a prisoner disguised in gold? Perhaps she saw both. Perhaps that was the secret of her strength. She became two women in one. Arsinoe II, the girl who lost her freedom. Arsinoe II, the queen who commanded empires. Arsinoe II did not simply vanish into the annals of Egyptian history as another consort, another queen whose name would fade into the stone. No, her presence lingered, etched not only in temples and decrees, but in the very psyche of the Ptolemaic dynasty. She became more than a woman, more than a survivor. She became an idea, one that frightened, fascinated, and enthralled her world. When she died in 270 BCE, her brother husband Ptolemy II ensured her image was immortalized. Statues across Egypt depicted them not merely as king and queen, but as divine equals. She was not a woman anymore. She was Aphrodite. She was Isis. She was a sacred embodiment of fertility and power. The people were taught to worship her as the Philadelphos, the goddess who loved her brother, a title that both sanctified her trauma and elevated her suffering into ritual. In the smoky taverns of Alexandria, people remembered her origins. The girl married off by her father at 13, the widow who survived assassination plots, the queen who bound herself to her own blood to maintain her throne. For some, she was a victim of incestuous power games. For others, she was a mastermind. Her influence reached far beyond her lifetime. The cult of Arsinoe spread throughout Egypt and even into Greece, where sailors prayed to her for protection on the seas. Shrines were built in her honor, and her image appeared on coins, her gaze serene, her crown heavy with divine authority. She became a living memory, worshipped long after her body was dust. Yet every symbol of divinity carried with it a shadow of cruelty. Later generations of historians, both Egyptian and Greek, whispered that Arsinoe's ambition had not been innocent. They hinted that her rise to power was paved with manipulation and ruthlessness, that behind the public face of the goddess queen lay a woman hardened by betrayal, one who had learned to wield poison, politics, and fear as tools of survival. Some even claimed that her devotion to her brother was not only piety but strategy, that she embraced the role of sister wife not out of love, but out of cold necessity. To remain relevant, to remain alive, her legacy, then, was not just one of sanctity, it was one of warning. For to survive in the world of the Ptolemies was to consume or be consumed. Arsinoe had been both. She had drunk deeply of suffering, and in turn she became the chalice others drank from. The ordinary people of Egypt, bound to her cult, may never have known the depth of her wounds. To them, she was eternal, smiling in reliefs, radiant in temple carvings, a goddess who blessed their harvests. But those who studied the palace walls closely, those who remembered the tales told in hushed tones, saw another truth, that Arsinoe's divinity had been forged in torment, that the cost of her crown had been her innocence, her freedom, and perhaps even her humanity. And so, Arsinoe II remained suspended between two images, the divine queen, worshipped as Isis reborn, and the broken girl, forever bound by blood to the very family that destroyed her. Her legacy is not one that comforts. It is one that unsettles. For it asks a question that echoes across the centuries. How much pain must one endure to hold power? And at what point does survival itself become a kind of cruelty? The dynasty she left behind would repeat her story in grotesque cycles, brother marrying sister, queens wielding power through beds and thrones, blood binding families tighter than loyalty. The Ptolemaic court became infamous for its incestuous unions, each one justified by divine precedent. And who had given them that precedent, if not Arsinoe II? The girl who was sacrificed became the goddess who sanctioned the sacrifice of others. The victim became the standard. The wound became the crown. And though centuries have passed, her shadow lingers, an eternal reminder that power never comes without a price.